Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5-340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management. This is part one of the readings from Section 13, Collaborative Governance, Mission-Based Procurement and Contracting. We are diving deep today into a pair of sources that really tackle one of the trickiest balancing acts in modern government, efficiency versus accountability.
Yeah, it's this constant tension, isn't it? And it gets really sharp when you talk about public service delivery, social programs, infrastructure, utilities, you name it, and how that delivery gets shifted.
Shifted from direct government control into, well, private or maybe semi-private hands.
Exactly. And that shift isn't just about changing who manages the day-to-day. It creates potentially huge legal and operational ripples. The big question is, can government hand off its authority without also handing off its constitutional obligations?
Obligations like due process, equal protection.
Precisely. And if they can sidestep those restraints legally, what does that actually do to the public policy goals they're supposed to be achieving? Like, say, sustainability. Does it help or hinder?
That's exactly what we want to explore today. We're tracing this conflict from the foundational legal thinking back in the 80s right up to how it plays out in policy now.
Okay.
So our first source really lays that constitutional groundwork. It's Harold J. Sullivan's 1987 paper, Privatization of Public Services, a growing threat to constitutional rights.
It sounded a pretty serious alarm about something called the state action doctrine.
A really foundational piece. And then we're going to connect that, historical legal context to a more modern hands-on study. This one's The Contradictions in Alternative Service Delivery by Catherine Furlong and Karen Baker from 2009.
Right, and they looked specifically at municipal water supply in Canada.
Yeah, showing how these newer organizational models, these alternative service delivery things, can create these deep systemic conflicts that actually undermine goals like water conservation. It's fascinating stuff. So the core question driving us today is, if privatization offers this kind of escape hatch from constitutional accountability, does that freedom actually lead to better public services? Or does it maybe create a system with, perverse incentives that end up failing the public mission?
That's the puzzle. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's start with Sullivan's 1987 paper. He really zeroes in on this fundamental gap in American law. The Constitution, especially the 14th Amendment, it gives you strong protections, things like due process, equal protection, but only against the government acting arbitrarily.
That's the key, isn't it? Against government action. If a private company or another private citizen messes with your rights, generally the Constitution doesn't step in.
It's designed to limit the state, the entity with sovereign power.
Exactly. It's not meant to police every interaction between private parties. But Sullivan's point was that governments kind of figured out they could use privatization as a way to, slip out from under those constitutional limits.
And the way they do this legally hinges on a distinction that sounds a bit academic, but it's got huge real-world impact. It's the difference between the provision of public services and the production of those services.
Right. This distinction, I think it came from scholars like Ted Koldery. It's absolutely crucial. So provision, that's the government deciding if a service should exist, how much money it gets, what the rules are, who qualifies. That's the policymaking hat.
Government keeps that role.
Usually, yes. But then there's production. That's the actual doing of the thing. Operating the service, running the facilities, managing the staff, delivering the goods.
Can you give us a quick example just to make it concrete?
Sure. Think about school lunches. The school district decides, okay, we're going to offer free or reduced price meals, sets the nutrition rules, decides who's eligible. That's provision.
Got it.
But then they hire a private catering company to actually cook the food, manage the serving lines, hire and fire the kitchen staff. That's production. Now, if that private catering company fires a worker without what we'd consider proper due process,
suddenly that worker doesn't have the same constitutional protections they would have had if the school district itself employed them.
Exactly. That's Sullivan's core argument. The government keeps control over provision, but by privatizing the production, they create this kind of constitutional firewall. The person receiving the service or the employee delivering it, they lose rights they otherwise would have had.
Which brings us right to the core legal idea here, the state action doctrine.
This goes way back to the civil rights cases in 1883. The fundamental rule is 14th Amendment protections. They only kick in when there's state action. If it's purely private conduct, the Constitution doesn't reach it.
So the really disturbing implication Sullivan highlighted is that governments can hand over the doing of public services, even if they're still paying the bills and setting many of the rules.
and effectively create immunity from constitutional challenges related to how that service is delivered on the ground. They keep the policy control, but dodge the operational accountability under the Constitution.
Okay, so how did the courts deal with this when private actors started doing things that looked a lot like government work? Sullivan reviewed how the judiciary tried, and mostly failed, to bridge this gap.
Yeah, he looked at three main ways the courts grappled with this public-private mix over the 20th century and basically showed why each approach doesn't really end up protecting citizens very well. Let's start with the one that initially seemed like it might have the most potential, the symbiotic relationship doctrine.
Okay, symbiotic relationship. What's the story there?
This came out of a really important case in 1961, Burton v. Wilmington Parking Authority. It's an interesting setup. You had a privately owned coffee shop, the Eagle Coffee Shop,
Okay.
and it was leasing space inside a parking garage owned by the city of Wilmington, Delaware, a public facility. The problem was the coffee shop was discriminating based on race, refusing to serve black customers.
And the city, the parking authority, they weren't telling the shop to discriminate, right? They were just the landlord.
Correct. They just allowed it to happen on their property. But the Supreme Court found that the relationship between the state, the parking authority, and the private restaurant was symbiotic,
Meaning?
meaning they were so intertwined financially and operationally that they were sort of mutually dependent. The restaurant was seen as an integral and indeed indispensable part of the public parking garage's plan to be financially self-sufficient. The city benefited from the rent, the restaurant benefited from the location and customers.
That sounds like it could apply really broadly, though. Couldn't you say almost any government contractor or subsidized group has a symbiotic relationship? They get public money, the government gets a service.
Logically, you'd think so. If mutual benefit makes private action into state action, then wow, that covers a lot of ground. Almost all publicly funded production would suddenly be subject to the Constitution. But the Supreme Court basically slammed the brakes on that idea almost immediately. They really limited the Burton finding to its specific facts, that unusual landlord-tenant situation. It didn't become a general rule. So that avenue for accountability largely got shut down.
Okay, so the symbiotic relationship idea didn't pan out. What was the next attempt? Sullivan points to government regulation, right? Especially the Jackson v. Metropolitan Edison case from 1974.
Yeah, and this is where things get really quite tough for plaintiffs trying to claim constitutional protection. Jackson involved a customer whose electricity was cut off by Metropolitan Edison, which was a private utility but heavily regulated by the state of Pennsylvania.
And the cutoff happened without what she felt was adequate due process, proper notice, or a hearing.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. The utility's specific procedures for cutting off service, they were actually detailed in a tariff, a set of rules that had been filed with and approved by the state's Public Utility Commission. A government body approved the process.
Wait a minute. If a state agency approved the exact process being challenged, how is that not state action? Isn't the state involved enough right there?
You'd think so. But the Supreme Court said no. They introduced this test. There has to be a sufficiently close nexus between the state and the specific action being challenged.
A close nexus. What does that mean in practice?
It means the state has to be more than just a regulator or approver. The state has to have basically compelled or significantly encouraged the specific policy or action. In Jackson, the court reasoned that the utility initiated the shutoff policy itself. The state commission just approved it. They didn't order the utility to adopt that specific policy. So no sufficiently close nexus, no state action.
That's kind of mind-blowing. So a state-regulated monopoly, providing an essential service like electricity, can operate under rules that would be flat-out unconstitutional if the city itself ran the power company.
That's precisely the outcome. Unless you can prove the state forced the private company to adopt the rights-violating policy, which is incredibly hard to do, extensive regulation just isn't enough. Regulatory approval doesn't equal state action.
It really does feel like a way for the state to wash its hands of constitutional responsibility while still controlling the service through regulation.
Yeah.
Okay, so regulation isn't enough either. What about just paying the bills? Sullivan looked at government funding too, right? The cases Rendell Baker v. Kahn and Blum v. Uretsky in 1982.
Yes, and these might be the most startling for people who think public money should come with public accountability. In both cases, you had private institutions. One was a school for kids with special needs, the other a nursing home, mostly serving Medicaid patients.
Okay.
And both got a huge chunk of their funding directly from the state. We're talking 90%, even close to 100% in some instances. And they were heavily regulated too. The state was essentially their main, if not only, source of income.
So almost entirely publicly funded. What happened in the cases?
In Rindle Baker, the private school fired some staff members, allegedly for speaking out against administrative policies. They claimed they were denied due process rights they would have had as public employees.
And Bloom?
In Bloom, the private nursing home made decisions to transfer patients to facilities offering a lower level of care. This decision affected the patient's Medicaid benefits, and they argued they weren't given proper notice or hearing rights.
So in both cases, actions taken by these heavily funded private entities were challenged as violating constitutional rights. What did the court say?
They said unequivocally no. Constitutional restraints did not apply. In Rendell Baker, the court reiterated that the state needed to have exercised coercive power or provided such significant encouragement that the private decision could be treated as the state's own, since the school's board made the firing decision independently.
Even though state money paid the salaries and built the building.
It wasn't state action. And similarly, in Bloom, the nursing home's decision to transfer patients was based on, quote, independent medical judgment. Even though the state adjusted Medicaid payments based on that decision, the state didn't compel the specific transfer. It just reacted to the private choice.
So the big and frankly pretty bleak takeaway from Sullivan's analysis of these cases is
The Constitution doesn't follow the money. You can have the government footing almost the entire bill, setting tons of rules, but if the production, the day-to-day operation and decision-making is in private hands, then employees can lose their jobs, and citizens can lose access to services without the basic constitutional due process they'd get from a direct government agency.
okay, so if symbiotic relationships don't work, regulation doesn't work, and even massive public funding doesn't trigger constitutional protections. Is there anything left? Is there any function that if a private entity performs it, it's always considered state action?
There is one last possibility, but it's very narrow. It's called the public function doctrine.
Public function doctrine.
But again, the Supreme Court has interpreted this very, very restrictively. To qualify under this doctrine, the private entity has to be performing a function that is, and this is the key phrase, traditionally exclusively reserved to the state.
Traditionally exclusively reserved. Wow, that sounds like a high bar.
It is an incredibly high bar. Think about what's truly only ever been done by the government. The classic examples that courts have recognized are things like running elections or maybe operating a private town that has basically taken over all the functions of a municipality, like in an old case called Marsh v. Alabama, functions that are just inherently sovereign.
But the list of things that are not considered exclusive seems much longer and includes some surprising things.
Oh, absolutely. Remember Jackson. Providing electricity? Nope, not traditionally exclusive. And there was another key case, Flagg Brothers v. Brooks in 1978. The court said a private warehouseman selling someone's goods to satisfy a lien, even though it was done according to a state law.
That wasn't an exclusive public function either, even though it involves property rights and state authorization.
Correct. The court's reasoning there was interesting. They said because the person whose goods were being sold had other potential legal remedies available, like suing the warehouseman wasn't exercising an exclusive prerogative of the sovereign.
Okay, so that adds another hurdle. If the government keeps any role, or if the citizen has any other way to potentially seek redress, even if it's not a constitutional claim,
Then the private actor probably isn't performing an exclusive public function, and the Constitution likely doesn't apply to their actions. It basically means the government has to have completely abdicated all involvement and oversight for the doctrine to maybe kick in.
and Sullivan pointed out that the court explicitly didn't rule on whether things like education, fire protection, police services, even tax collection, all heavily privatized in various ways today, count as exclusive functions.
Right. They left that door open, which is worrying. And in Rendell Baker, they later confirmed education is not considered an exclusively public function. So the space where this doctrine might apply is really, really small.
The chilling summary from Sullivan back in '87 seems to be, if the government shares the work, the constitutional protection often just evaporates. And you can see why. From a purely efficiency-driven perspective, being able to privatize production and shed those constitutional constraints would look very appealing to some government leaders.
It absolutely created a perceived pathway to efficiency without the perceived hassle of due
Okay,
process.
so Sullivan sets up this constitutional danger zone in 1987. Governments basically got a signal that efficiency could potentially trump accountability, legally speaking. Now let's fast forward a couple of decades, shift countries to Canada, and look at how these ideas about new management models actually played out on the ground. This brings us to our second source, Furlong and Baker on Alternative Service Delivery, or ASD.
Right. This jump is important because the legal freedom Sullivan described really helped fuel the rise of what became known as New Public Management, or NPM, and broader neoliberal governance reforms. The whole idea was, government is inefficient, bureaucratic, prone to state failure, so let's bring in private sector methods to fix it.
And the result, in Canada at least, was dramatic. You mentioned over half the public service now operates outside traditional departments.
Yeah, something like 55%. It's a huge shift. And ASD is the umbrella term for how this happened. Furlong and Baker define it pretty broadly, basically any alternative to the old way of direct government provision. So that includes creating agencies, devolving power, partnerships, contracting out, all the way to full privatization.
But they make a really important point right up front. We shouldn't mix up two different kinds of change.
Exactly. They argue we often conflate changes in governance with changes in business models. They're related but distinct. Governance is about who holds authority, how decisions are made, that whole shift from government to governance where power gets dispersed or delegated.
Okay, so governance is about the power structure.
Right. Whereas the business model is about the organizational structure. Is it owned publicly or privately? Is it a corporation or a department? How is financial risk managed? That kind of thing.
So you could, for instance, turn a city department into a city-owned corporation, change the business model, but keep all the decision-making power firmly with the city council. No real change in governance.
Precisely. But the trend under these neoliberal reforms has definitely been towards pushing both. They tend to favor delegated governments, where significant power is handed off to non-state actors, and they often push for devolution, moving authority downwards or outwards to these arm's-length bodies.
And this whole movement often gets tied up with an environmental idea too, right? Liberal environmentalism.
Yeah, that's the belief that the best way to achieve environmental goals like conservation or pollution reduction is through market mechanisms. Things like putting a price on resources, commercializing services, privatization. Let the market handle it.
Okay, and here's where Furlong and Baker see the big contradiction starting to emerge. The assumption is that these efficient arm's-length business models, driven by market logic, will naturally lead to better sustainability outcomes.
Right. But their case study of Canadian municipal water utilities really challenges that assumption. Does restructuring governance and changing the business model actually help with something like water conservation? The answer turns out to be, well, pretty complicated and often counterintuitive.
All right, let's dive into that case study. Canadian municipal water utilities. What did they actually find about how the organizational structure affected water conservation efforts?
They found a really clear pattern. Basically, the further removed the water utilities business model was from direct municipal government control, think independent commissions or corporatized utilities or management structures heavily delegated to outside groups, the more constraints there seem to be on implementing really ambitious or comprehensive conservation programs.
Wow, okay, that's the opposite of what you might expect. The models designed for efficiency are actually hindering the conservation mission. Why? What were the constraints?
They identified three big ones, all sort of interconnected and baked into these arm's-length models. First, these organizations tend to develop a primary focus on water as a commodity.
Meaning they see water mainly as something to sell.
Pretty much, especially if the model is built around full cost recovery, their financial health, their budget, maybe even staff bonuses depend directly on the volume of water they sell. Revenue generation becomes a core objective.
Okay, and if selling water is key to your survival, that leads directly to the second constraint, which sounds like the real killer, the revenue loss deterrent.
This is the absolute crux of the problem they found. These arm's-length utilities, because they need the revenue from water sales, they strongly favor supply-side conservation measures.
Like fixing leaks.
Exactly. Fixing leaks, replacing old pipes. These things recover water that was being lost but should have been sold. So leak detection actually boosts potential revenue. It pays for itself in commodity terms.
Okay, that makes sense financially. But what about getting people to use less water? Demand-side management.
That's where the model breaks down. Things like public education campaigns, rebates for efficient toilets or washing machines, incentives for businesses to cut water use, these are demand-side programs. And if they're successful,
People buy less water, and the utility loses revenue.
precisely, it directly threatens their bottom line. Furlong and Baker actually quote utility staff saying they were sometimes discouraged from being too successful on conservation because it would hurt revenues.
That's just a stunning paradox. You set up an organization, maybe even hire experts, ostensibly to manage water sustainably, but the very structure you create penalizes them for actually succeeding at the conservation part of the mission.
It's a classic perverse incentive. The mandate for economic sustainability, for financial viability under that business model, clashes head-on with the mandate for environmental sustainability. Why would you spend a lot of time and money convincing people to use less of the very product you need to sell?
Okay, commodity focused,
Yeah.
revenue loss deterrent. What was the third constraint?
Limited ambition. Because these arm's length bodies often operate more like private businesses, focused on quantifiable returns and maybe less comfortable with political processes, they tend to go for the less ambitious, easier to justify conservation programs.
Standard stuff, maybe?
Yeah, things that don't require deep community outreach or navigating complex local politics. They might stick to operational fixes rather than trying to foster bigger behavioral changes, which are harder to measure and potentially riskier politically or financially.
And they use Utilities Kingston, a municipal corporation, as an example of this.
Right. Utilities Kingston was good at water loss control, that internal supply side fix that saves water and protects revenue. But they were reportedly not engaging much in proactive demand side programs. From their business perspective, leaking pipes were lost money, but people simply using too much water wasn't necessarily their financial problem.
So if the supposedly efficient arm's-length model struggles with broad conservation, what about the old-fashioned way, the traditional municipal department, directly part of the city government? Furlong and Baker found some surprising strengths there, didn't they?
They did, and it's deeply ironic. The very thing these NPM reforms often criticize, political influence, bureaucratic processes, accountability to elected councils, actually turned out to be a strength when it came to conservation.
Yes.
Because these direct delivery models have to get their budgets and major programs approved by the municipal council. This forces them, whether they like it or not, to engage with the local political reality. They have to build support, consult with different groups, businesses, environmental NGOs, community associations.
That sounds slow and messy. Isn't that the inefficiency everyone wanted to get rid of?
It can definitely be slower and messier in the short run. But Furlong and Baker argue that this forced engagement, which is actually a form of delegated governance because they have to involve stakeholders to get council approval, leads to conservation programs that are more tailored, more innovative, better understood by the community, and ultimately more likely to stick around for the long haul.
They had an example for this too, right? Toronto Water.
Yes, Toronto Water is a great case. As a direct municipal department, they knew they needed city council buy-in for a big water efficiency plan. So what do? They actually hired a public consultation specialist who spent 2 years just doing outreach, talking to stakeholders, refining the plan based on feedback.
2 years. That sounds like a lot of process.
It was, and probably frustrating at times. But the plan that emerged from that extensive consultation had much broader and deeper support. It was more robust and politically durable than something an arm's-length board might have just tried to impose based on purely technical or financial logic.
So the takeaway is that the political interference that new public management tries to design out might actually be essential for ensuring that social and environmental goals don't get completely sidelined by purely economic ones.
That seems to be a major finding. The political accountability, the need to build consensus, acts as a crucial check and balance.
Which brings us right back to that core contradiction Furlong and Baker identified. The models that are explicitly designed to promote economic sustainability, things like full cost recovery, independent finances, using price signals, often turn out to be the least effective at fostering the kind of broad participation and programming needed for environmental sustainability.
Exactly. There's a fundamental trade-off happening. The arm's-length models tend to really like economic instruments metering, pricing structures, because those fit their business logic. But they often discount or struggle to justify the sociopolitical programs.
And the research showed a specific gap there.
Yeah, the survey data was really telling. When they asked utility staff across different models what was most needed versus what was actually being implemented, the biggest gap was for public education and public participation
The
programs.
soft stuff.
The soft stuff. Even though staff generally agreed these programs were important and often relatively easy to implement logistically, they weren't getting done as much in the arm's length models.
And the reason came back to the business mandate.
Pretty much. Staff in those models explain that because they operated under a corporate or business-like mandate, they really needed to justify every expenditure with a clear cost-benefit analysis. And it's just much harder to quantify the financial return on investment for a public awareness campaign compared to, say, installing new meters or fixing leaks. The model itself discouraged those essential social components.
Which suggests that even if you adopt these alternative models, you still need some form of government intervention, not just for the constitutional rights Sullivan talked about, but also just for basic fairness and ensuring the social side isn't lost.
Absolutely essential. The case of Hamilton's universal water metering program illustrated this perfectly. The utility staff, operating under efficiency pressures, initially proposed a really aggressive plan.
What did they want to do?
They wanted to basically force compliance quickly by tripling the flat rate water charges for anyone who refused to get a meter installed, and they wanted a very fast 2-year payback period for the cost of the meters. Pure economic efficiency logic.
But the elected council stepped in.
Yes, the municipal council reviewed the plan and pushed back. They felt it placed too much burden too quickly on potentially vulnerable residents, so they mandated changes. They reduced the penalty for refusing a meter and extended the payback period to 5 years.
Did that kill the program's effectiveness?
Not at all. It eased the social impact, made it more equitable, but the program was still overwhelmingly successful. By the final deadline in 2007, something like 99.8% of users had meters installed. It showed that elected officials have a critical role in mediating between the drive for pure efficiency and the need for social equity, regardless of the utility's specific business model.
Okay, so we got a picture emerging. Direct municipal departments face political limitations, but are better at integrating social concerns. Arm's-length models are maybe more financially disciplined, but struggle with conservation incentives and social programs. If neither model is perfect on its own for achieving broad, sustainable water conservation, what's the solution?
Well, Furlong and Baker argue that we need to recognize conservation isn't just a local issue. It's not something a single municipality or utility can fully solve in isolation. Many of the most effective conservation tools actually require action from multiple levels of government, federal, provincial, and municipal.
And if that coordination doesn't happen?
You get what they call a governance gap. The necessary policies or regulations just don't exist at the right scale, leaving the local actors kind of stuck.
Can you give some examples of tools that really need senior government involvement, things a local utility just can't do actively by itself?
Sure. Think about structural or operational tools. Utility staff in the study expressed a lot of frustration that higher levels of government, provincial, or federal weren't setting mandatory efficiency standards for things like toilets, shower heads, washing machines.
Why is that a problem for the local utility?
Because without national or provincial standards, each individual municipality might feel like it has to create its own incentive programs or even local bylaws to phase out inefficient fixtures. It's incredibly duplicative and inefficient. If the federal government just said, okay, as of this date, you can no longer sell toilets that use more than X liters per flush, it solves the problem instantly for every single utility in the country.
So the lack of action higher-ups actually creates inefficiency and extra work at the local level, no matter how the local utility is structured.
Precisely. Or look at economic tools, something like ring fencing water revenues, legally requiring that all money collected from water bills must be reinvested back into the water system, not diverted to cover other city budget gaps.
That sounds sensible for long-term sustainability.
It is, but it usually requires provincial legislation or regulation overseeing municipal finances. A local council facing budget pressures might be tempted to raid the water fund unless a higher authority prevents it. So again, senior government involvement is key.
It seems like without that broader regulatory framework from senior governments, these local ASD reforms are almost set up to fail, at least on the environmental front.
That's a strong implication of their findings, yes. The local model matters, but it can't overcome gaps in the larger governance structure.
So if the trend is still towards more arm's-length delegated models, what absolutely must the role of government be? The government that did the delegating in the first place.
They can't just delegate and walk away. Furlong and Baker argue that government needs to step back in, not necessarily to run things directly, but to act as an accountability backstop.
Meaning?
Meaning that just hoping for political will at the local level isn't enough. As the Hamilton case showed, intervention was needed. If you're going to have these arm's-length bodies delivering public services, their accountability for meeting public goals like conservation needs to be reinforced by clear standards, performance measurement, and potentially sanctions imposed by higher levels of government.
We've really moved beyond that initial neoliberal idea of just shrinking the state and letting the market sort it out.
Completely. The conclusion is pretty stark. When you combine devolution of authority with arm's-length organizational structures under a purely hands-off policy approach, it actually seems to hinder sustainability. Why? Because it reduces the necessary regulatory engagement and standard-setting role of government at all scales.
So the shift in governance shouldn't just be about giving away power, devolution. It needs to be about strategic engagement. Senior governments setting the rules of the game, providing the standards, measuring the outcome.
Exactly. They need to create the conditions under which these alternative delivery models can actually succeed at meeting public goals, not just financial ones.
Which, interestingly, brings us right back around to Sullivan's original point from 1987. Whether we're talking about basic constitutional rights like due process or policy goals like environmental sustainability.
When public authority gets transferred or delegated, the standards of accountability can't just be optional extras left to the discretion of the new provider. They need to be clearly defined and enforced by the government that holds the ultimate public trust.
This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We went from the fundamental legal problem, the fact that constitutional rights often don't follow the public money when services are privatized, creating this efficiency accountability trade-off.
All the way to the practical consequences decades later, seeing how similar dynamics played out in Canadian water management, where the drive for organizational efficiency potentially undermined conservation goals.
The big takeaway for you, listening, seems to be this critical distinction. Changing the organizational structure of the business model isn't the same thing as changing the governance, the accountability framework.
Right. The flexibility and potential efficiency gains promised by things like alternative service delivery come with a real risk. They risk sacrificing essential public goods, whether that's constitutional rights or environmental sustainability, if the focus shifts too heavily towards just the financial performance of the delivery organization.
So for these alternative models to actually work in the public interest, the governance around them needs to be active, not passive. It can't just be about handing off responsibility. It needs to involve strategic engagement from government at all levels, setting clear standards, demanding accountability, ensuring those public goals are met.
Which leads us back to that fundamental tension Sullivan raised. When we choose to privatize or delegate the production of public services, often explicitly seeking the flexibility and efficiency of the private sector, we are often implicitly or sometimes explicitly accepting a lower standard of constitutional protection than if the public sector did the work itself.
So here's the final thought for you to chew on, building on everything we've discussed. Given how much that private sector flexibility is often praised as a key benefit in procurement and contracting, are we as a society prepared to pay the price for maximum efficiency if that price includes weakening even the minimal constitutional safeguards for employees and citizens? Or should we insist that the terms of any contract for delivering public services explicitly require the private provider to uphold the very same due process and equal protection rights that citizens are guaranteed when dealing directly with the government? Where do you draw that line? Something to think about.